Number 1. Derek Michael Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer whose name became synonymous with police brutality and systemic racism following the murder of George Floyd, was born on March 19, 1976, in Oakdale, Minnesota, to a family that included a father who was a certified public accountant and a mother who was a housewife. A relatively middle-class upbringing in the suburbs of the Twin Cities that provided little indication of the global notoriety he would eventually achieve as the central figure in one of the most significant criminal trials in American history. Chauvin attended Park Center High School in Brooklyn Park and later pursued a career in law enforcement, obtaining an associate degree in law enforcement from Dakota County Technical College and eventually a bachelor's degree in police science from Metropolitan State University, educational achievements that reflected a commitment to a career in public service that spanned nearly 2 decades on the Minneapolis police force. He joined the Minneapolis Police Department in 2001 and served for 19 years, during which time he was involved in several use-of-force incidents and shootings, receiving medals of valor and commendations but also generating civilian complaints that foreshadowed the catastrophic event that would end his career and change the world. Colleagues described him as a quiet, sometimes abrasive officer who worked off-duty security details, including at a nightclub called El Nuevo Rodeo where he would cross paths with George Floyd, though the extent of their acquaintance remains a matter of dispute, and his professional reputation was that of a seasoned, if sometimes aggressive, veteran of the force. The victim of his fatal act of violence was George Perry Floyd Jr., a 46-year-old black man born in Fayetteville, North Carolina, who was raised in Houston, Texas, in the 3rd Ward, a historically black neighborhood where he was known as a talented athlete and a gentle giant. A man who faced struggles with addiction and incarceration but who was described by friends and family as a person who was trying to turn his life around, a father, a brother, a son, and a friend whose death would spark a global reckoning on race and justice. Floyd was a towering figure at 6 feet 4 inches, but those who knew him spoke of his peaceful demeanor and his love for his daughter, Gianna, and his death on May 25, 2020, robbed a family of a beloved member and a community of a man who had become a symbol of the systemic devaluation of black lives. The setting for the tragedy was the Powderhorn community of Minneapolis, specifically the area in front of Cup Foods, a grocery store at the intersection of East 38th Street and Chicago Avenue, a vibrant, diverse neighborhood that would become the epicenter of a global movement in the site of an autonomous zone known as George Floyd Square in the aftermath of the killing. The timeline of events leading to the crime began on the evening of May 25, 2020, when a convenience store employee at Cup Foods called 911 to report that a man, later identified as Floyd, had allegedly passed a counterfeit $20 bill, a minor offense that would result in an encounter with police that ended in tragedy. Officers Thomas Lane and J. Alexander Quing arrived first, locating Floyd in a vehicle nearby, and after a brief interaction, they attempted to place him in their squad car, at which point Floyd began to struggle, complaining of claustrophobia and anxiety, and stating that he was not a violent person. Derek Chauvin arrived on the scene shortly thereafter as the most senior officer, and as the struggle continued, Chauvin pulled Floyd from the vehicle and onto the pavement, where he knelt on Floyd's neck and back for a horrifying 9 minutes and 29 seconds, a duration that became a rallying cry for protesters. The crime itself was a prolonged and public display of force that shocked the world, with Chauvin pressing his knee into Floyd's neck while Floyd lay handcuffed and prone on the street, gasping for air, pleading for his mother, and eventually falling silent and losing consciousness, all while bystanders pleaded with the officers to stop and captured the incident on their cell phones. The discovery and initial investigation were instantaneous due to the viral nature of the video, which spread across social media within hours, igniting immediate outrage and protests in Minneapolis and around the world. The Minneapolis Police Department fired Chauvin and the 3 other officers involved the following day, and the FBI and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension launched a joint investigation into the incident, facing immense public pressure to bring charges against the officers responsible. The forensic investigation involved a detailed autopsy by the Hennepin County Medical Examiner, which classified Floyd's death as a homicide caused by cardiopulmonary arrest complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression, noting that Floyd had underlying health conditions and drugs in his system but that the restraint was the primary cause of death. The breakthrough and arrest occurred on May 29, 2020, 4 days after the killing, when Chauvin was taken into custody by the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension and charged with third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter, charges that were later upgraded to include second-degree unintentional murder. The legal proceedings were a global spectacle, with the trial beginning on March 8, 2021, in the Hennepin County Government Center, heavily fortified with barbed wire and National Guard troops, and broadcast live to a worldwide audience. The prosecution, led by Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison and a team of assistant attorneys general, presented a case that relied heavily on the graphic video evidence, the testimony of medical experts who explained the physiological causes of Floyd's death, the testimony of Minneapolis Police Chief Medaria Arredondo, who testified that Chauvin's actions were not consistent with department policy, and the emotional testimony of bystanders who expressed their trauma and guilt at being unable to save Floyd. The defense, led by attorney Eric Nelson, argued that Floyd's death was caused by his underlying health conditions and drug use, and that Chauvin's use of force was reasonable given the situation, a strategy that ultimately failed to convince the jury. The jury deliberated for 10 hours over 2 days before returning a verdict on April 20, 2021, finding Chauvin guilty of second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter, a rare instance of a police officer being held criminally accountable for the death of a civilian. The sentencing hearing took place on June 25, 2021, and Judge Peter Cahill sentenced Chauvin to 22.5 years in prison, a sentence that exceeded the state's recommended guidelines and reflected the gravity of the offense and the profound betrayal of his role as a peace officer. In addition to the state charges, Chauvin pleaded guilty to federal civil rights violations in December 2021, admitting that he had violated Floyd's constitutional rights, and was sentenced to 21 years in federal prison to be served concurrently with his state sentence. The current status and lasting impact are significant, with Chauvin currently serving his sentence in a federal prison, having survived a stabbing attack by another inmate in November 2023, while his name remains a byword for police brutality. The murder of George Floyd and the conviction of Derek Chauvin sparked a global movement for racial justice, led to widespread calls for police reform, and forced a national conversation about the role of law enforcement in American society, a legacy that will endure for generations. Number 2. Daniel Holtzclaw, a former Oklahoma City police officer who used his badge to prey on vulnerable black women in a pattern of serial sexual predation that shocked the conscience of the nation, was born on December 10, 1986, in Guam, the son of a white father who was a police officer and an Asian mother who worked as a schoolteacher, a mixed-race heritage that would later become a point of discussion during his trial and in media coverage of his crimes. Holtzclaw grew up in Enid, Oklahoma, where he was a standout football player in high school, earning a scholarship to play linebacker at Eastern Michigan University, where he set a school record for tackles in a single game, a testament to his physical prowess and competitive drive that he would later exploit to intimidate and assault his victims. He graduated from Eastern Michigan University with a degree in criminal justice and returned to Oklahoma to follow in his father's footsteps, joining the Oklahoma City Police Department in 2011, where he was assigned to the Spring Lake Division, a patrol unit that covered several low-income, predominantly black neighborhoods in the northeast quadrant of the city. Holtzclaw was known as an aggressive officer who made numerous arrests for drug and prostitution offenses, building a reputation for his high numbers of stops and arrests, but behind this facade of proactive policing lay a predator who used the power of his uniform to target women he believed would not be believed or who would be too afraid to report him. The victims of Daniel Holtzclaw were 13 black women, ranging in age from 17 to 57, all of whom lived in the impoverished neighborhoods he patrolled, and all of whom he encountered while on duty, exploiting their vulnerabilities, histories of addiction, criminal records, or sex work, to coerce them into submitting to his sexual demands. One of his victims, identified only as JB in court documents, was a 17-year-old girl who was walking home from a friend's house when Holtzclaw stopped her, accused her of trespassing, and forced her to perform oral sex on him in the back of his patrol car, threatening to arrest her if she refused. Another victim, identified as TS, was a woman with a history of drug addiction who was walking to her mother's house when Holtzclaw offered her a ride, then drove her to a remote area and raped her. The victims described a pattern of behavior in which Holtzclaw would run background checks on women he encountered, looking for outstanding warrants or criminal history, and then use that information to blackmail them into compliance, telling them that he would let them go in exchange for sexual acts, and that no one would believe them if they reported him because of their pasts. The setting for Holtzclaw's crimes was the predominantly black neighborhoods of northeast Oklahoma City, areas struggling with poverty and crime, where residents often viewed the police with a mixture of fear and suspicion, a dynamic that Holtzclaw exploited to find victims who he believed were powerless to resist him. The timeline of his predatory spree stretched from late 2013 to June 2014, a period during which he escalated his behavior from harassment to sexual assault and rape, targeting women who he calculated would be too afraid to come forward. The discovery and initial investigation began on June 18, 2014, when a woman named JB came forward to police to report that an officer had sexually assaulted her, a report that investigators initially might have dismissed but for the dogged work of Detective Kim Davis of the Oklahoma City Police Department's Sex Crimes Unit. Davis took the report seriously and began investigating, reviewing Holtzclaw's stops and arrests and looking for other potential victims, a painstaking process that involved cross-referencing his activities with calls for service in the areas he patrolled. As the investigation progressed, more victims began to come forward, each telling a similar story of being stopped by a police officer who used his authority to coerce them into sexual acts, and the forensic investigation into Holtzclaw's conduct became one of the most extensive in the department's history. Forensic analysts from the Oklahoma City Police Crime Lab examined DNA evidence from the victims, including a swab from one victim's genes that matched Holtzclaw's DNA profile, providing crucial scientific evidence that corroborated the victims' accounts. Investigators also obtained GPS data from Holtzclaw's patrol car, which showed that he had been at the locations where the assaults occurred at the times the victims described, contradicting his claims that he had not been in those areas. The breakthrough in the investigation came when Detective Davis and her team identified a pattern that matched the modus operandi of a single officer, and after multiple victims identified Holtzclaw from a photo lineup, a warrant was issued for his arrest. On August 21, 2014, Holtzclaw was called to the police station, where he was taken into custody by fellow officers, a dramatic moment in which a police officer was arrested for crimes committed under the color of law, and he was subsequently charged with multiple counts of rape, forcible oral sodomy, sexual battery, and other offenses. The legal proceedings against Holtzclaw began with a preliminary hearing in which the prosecution presented evidence from multiple victims, establishing probable cause for the charges, and his bail was set at $5 million, an unusually high figure that reflected the severity of the charges and the potential danger he posed to the community. The trial began in November 2015 in Oklahoma County District Court, with District Judge Timothy Henderson presiding and a jury of 8 men and 4 women, all of whom were white, a fact that became a point of contention for the defense, which had sought a change of venue due to pre-trial publicity but failed to get the trial moved. The prosecution presented testimony from 13 victims who described in detail how Holtzclaw had stopped them, threatened them, and sexually assaulted them, while the defense sought to undermine their credibility by highlighting their criminal records, drug use, and inconsistent statements. The prosecution also presented DNA evidence and GPS data that contradicted Holtzclaw's denials, and called expert witnesses who testified about the behavior of sexual predators and the dynamics of power and control in police misconduct. The jury deliberated for over 40 hours over 4 days before returning a verdict on December 10, 2015, Holtzclaw's 29th birthday, finding him guilty of 18 of the 36 charges against him, including 4 counts of first-degree rape, and recommending a sentence of 263 years in prison, effectively ensuring that he would never be a free man again. The sentencing hearing took place on January 21, 2016, and Judge Henderson formally sentenced Holtzclaw to 263 years in prison, a landmark sentence for a police officer convicted of sexual assault, and one that sent a powerful message that no one is above the law. Following his conviction, Holtzclaw was transferred to the custody of the Oklahoma Department of Corrections and is currently serving his sentence at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, a maximum security prison, where he will remain for the rest of his life. The lasting impact of the Holtzclaw case is significant, not only for the victims who found justice but for the broader conversation it sparked about police sexual misconduct, the vulnerability of marginalized communities, and the importance of holding law enforcement accountable for crimes committed under the color of authority. Number 3. Joseph Miedzianowski, a former Chicago police officer who led a double life as a gang leader, drug trafficker, and murderer, was born on January 19, 1955, in Chicago, Illinois, to a Polish-American family on the Northwest Side, a working-class background that he parlayed into a career in law enforcement that would eventually devolve into a criminal enterprise of staggering proportions. Miedzianowski joined the Chicago Police Department in 1977 and was assigned to the Gang Crimes Unit, where he gained a reputation as a tough, aggressive officer who knew the streets and was not afraid to use force, a reputation that won him respect among some colleagues but masked a darker reality. He was using his position to build a drug empire and protect his associates in the Latin Kings street gang. He was known for his flashy lifestyle, including expensive cars and jewelry, which he attributed to family wealth, but in reality, he was amassing a fortune through drug deals and extortion, using his badge to shake down drug dealers for money and product, and using his knowledge of police operations to tip off his gang associates about raids and investigations.
The victims of Miedzianowski's crimes were numerous, including rival drug dealers whom he robbed and intimidated, informants whom he betrayed and endangered, and the residents of Chicago's neighborhoods who suffered from the drugs and violence he facilitated. One specific victim was Jeffrey Wooten, a drug dealer whom Miedzianowski believed had stolen money from him, and whom he lured to a meeting under the pretense of a drug transaction, only to shoot and kill him in cold blood, a murder that went unsolved for years until federal investigators uncovered the truth. He also victimized the families of those he terrorized, using his police powers to plant evidence, file false charges, and ruin the lives of innocent people who crossed him or his associates, creating a climate of fear in the very communities he was sworn to protect. The setting for his crimes was the city of Chicago, a metropolis with a long history of political corruption and organized crime, where the line between law enforcement and the criminal underworld has often been blurred, and where Miedzianowski operated with impunity for years, protected by his reputation as a good cop and by a code of silence that discouraged his colleagues from questioning his activities. The timeline of his criminal career spanned nearly 2 decades, from the early 1980s until his arrest in 1997, during which time he rose through the ranks of the police department while simultaneously consolidating his power in the drug trade, forming alliances with gang members and corrupt officers alike. The discovery and initial investigation began in the mid-1990s, when federal authorities, acting on tips from informants and suspicious colleagues, launched a sprawling investigation into police corruption in Chicago, codenamed Operation Broken Star, which targeted Miedzianowski and other officers suspected of wrongdoing. The investigation involved the FBI, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Internal Affairs Division of the Chicago Police Department, and it relied heavily on undercover operations, wiretaps, and the cooperation of informants who were willing to risk their lives to expose the corruption. The forensic investigation into Miedzianowski's activities involved the analysis of thousands of pages of police records, financial documents, and telephone records, as well as ballistics testing that linked his service weapon to the murder of Jeffrey Wooten and other shootings. The breakthrough in the investigation came with the cooperation of several of Miedzianowski's associates, including a former girlfriend who was also a police officer and who provided crucial information about his criminal activities, and a gang member who agreed to wear a wire and record conversations in which Miedzianowski discussed drug deals and other crimes. The arrest occurred on February 12, 1997, when Miedzianowski was taken into custody by federal agents at his home, a dramatic takedown that sent shockwaves through the Chicago Police Department and the city's criminal underworld, and he was subsequently charged with a litany of federal crimes, including racketeering, conspiracy to distribute cocaine, and murder. The legal proceedings were extensive and complex, with the trial beginning in 1999 in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois, where prosecutors presented a case that detailed Miedzianowski's dual life as a cop and a kingpin, calling dozens of witnesses, including his former accomplices, who testified about his involvement in drug deals, robberies, and the murder of Jeffrey Wooten. The defense argued that the government's witnesses were unreliable criminals who were testifying to save themselves, but the sheer weight of the evidence, including tape recordings and financial records, was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for several days before returning a guilty verdict on all counts in June 1999, finding Miedzianowski guilty of racketeering, drug conspiracy, and murder, and he was immediately remanded into federal custody. The sentencing hearing took place on February 23, 2001, and United States District Judge Blanche Manning sentenced Miedzianowski to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for other offenses, a sentence that ensured he would die behind bars and that marked the end of one of the most corrupt careers in the history of American law enforcement. Following his conviction, Miedzianowski was transferred to the United States Penitentiary, Florence ADX, the federal supermax prison in Colorado, where he is currently serving his sentence in solitary confinement, isolated from other inmates and from the world he once terrorized. The lasting impact of the Miedzianowski case was profound, exposing deep rot within the Chicago Police Department, leading to reforms in the way officers are supervised and monitored, and serving as a cautionary tale about the potential for corruption when law enforcement officers are given unchecked power and lack proper oversight. Number 4. Drew Peterson, a former police sergeant in Bolingbrook, Illinois, who became infamous for the disappearance of his fourth wife, Stacy Peterson, and the subsequent reinvestigation into the death of his third wife, Kathleen Savio, was born on January 5, 1954, in Dalton, Illinois, a south suburb of Chicago, to a family of modest means, and he grew up with a desire for authority and control that would define his personal and professional life.
Peterson joined the United States Army after high school and briefly served as a military police officer before returning to civilian life and joining the Bolingbrook Police Department in 1977, where he rose through the ranks to become a sergeant, a position that gave him a measure of authority and a platform for the charm and arrogance that would later become his trademark persona. He was married 4 times, and his relationships with his wives were characterized by a pattern of control, intimidation, and abuse, a pattern that culminated in the death of his 3rd wife, Kathleen Savio, and the disappearance of his 4th wife, Stacey Peterson, events that would eventually expose him as a manipulative and calculating murderer. The victims of Drew Peterson's crimes were the women who trusted him and paid with their lives. Kathleen Savio, his 3rd wife, who was found dead in a dry bathtub in her home in 2004, her death initially ruled an accidental drowning despite suspicious bruises and a pending divorce settlement that would have cost Peterson dearly, and Stacey Peterson, his 4th wife, who disappeared without a trace in October 2007 at the age of 23, leaving behind 2 young children and a family. Desperate for answers. Kathleen Savio was a vibrant, 30-year-old woman at the time of her death, a nurse who was in the process of divorcing Peterson and who had documented his abusive behavior and her fears that he would kill her in letters to her lawyer and in reports to the police, warnings that went unheeded until it was too late. Stacey Peterson was a young woman who had met Peterson when she was a teenager and he was still married to Savio, and she became his 4th wife shortly after Savio's death, bearing him 2 children before vanishing at the age of 23, a disappearance that she had predicted to her sister and to a pastor, telling them that if anything happened to her, Peterson was responsible. The setting for the crimes was the quiet suburb of Bolingbrook, Illinois, a middle-class community where Drew Peterson was a well-known and respected figure, a police sergeant who presented himself as a devoted husband and father, and where the idea that he could be a murderer seemed absurd to many residents until the evidence became too overwhelming to ignore. The timeline of events leading to the exposure of his crimes began with the disappearance of Stacey Peterson on October 28, 2007, an event that immediately drew suspicion to her husband due to his history of domestic violence and the suspicious circumstances of Savio's death 3 years earlier. The discovery and initial investigation into Stacey's disappearance was launched by the Illinois State Police, who quickly zeroed in on Drew Peterson as the prime suspect, conducting searches of his home and vehicles, interviewing friends and family members, and re-examining the case of Kathleen Savio, whose death was reclassified as a homicide following a new autopsy ordered by the Will County State's Attorney's Office. The forensic investigation into Savio's death involved a team of forensic pathologists who reviewed the original autopsy findings and the crime scene photos, concluding that the bruises on her body and the circumstances of her death were inconsistent with an accidental drowning and were more consistent with a struggle and a homicide. In the case of Stacey Peterson, despite extensive searches of local parks, forests, and waterways, no body was ever found, a fact that initially hindered the investigation and forced prosecutors to rely on circumstantial evidence and hearsay statements to build a case against Peterson. The breakthrough in the investigation came with the passage of a new Illinois law, dubbed Drew's Law, which allowed hearsay statements from unavailable witnesses to be admitted as evidence in murder trials if the defendant was responsible for making the witness unavailable, a legislative change that was passed specifically in response to Peterson's case and that allowed prosecutors to use statements Savio had made to friends and family about her fears of Peterson to convict him for her murder. The arrest occurred on May 7, 2009, when Peterson was taken into custody by the Illinois State Police at his home in Bolingbrook and charged with the murder of Kathleen Savio, a moment that was captured by news cameras and broadcast around the world, marking the beginning of a legal saga that would last for years. The legal proceedings were lengthy and controversial, with the defense team, led by attorney Joel Brodsky, filing numerous motions to suppress the hearsay evidence and to change the venue of the trial, while the prosecution, led by Will County State's Attorney James Glasgow, fought to present a case built on the words of the victim herself, as well as the testimony of witnesses who described Peterson's history of abuse and his attempts to hire a hitman to kill Savio. The trial began in July 2012 in the Will County Courthouse, and it featured dramatic testimony from friends and relatives of Savio who recounted her statements about Peterson's threats, as well as testimony from Stacey Peterson's sister, who told the court that Stacey had called her in the days before her disappearance and said that Peterson had killed Savio and that she was afraid he would kill her too. The jury deliberated for 14 hours over 2 days before returning a verdict on September 6, 2012, finding Peterson guilty of first-degree murder, a conviction that was hailed as a victory for victims of domestic violence and a testament to the perseverance of prosecutors and investigators. The sentencing hearing took place on February 21, 2013, and Judge Edward Burmala sentenced Peterson to 38 years in prison, a sentence that reflected the brutality of the crime and the lack of remorse shown by the defendant, who had taunted the media and the public throughout the investigation with his arrogant demeanor and his claims of innocence. In a bizarre postscript, in 2015, while incarcerated at the Menard Correctional Center, Peterson was recorded attempting to hire a hitman to kill James Glasgow, the prosecutor who had put him behind bars, a crime for which he was subsequently convicted of solicitation of murder for hire and sentenced to an additional 40 years in prison, a sentence that ensures he will die in prison. The current status and lasting impact are that Peterson remains in the custody of the Illinois Department of Corrections, serving a combined sentence of 78 years, while the body of Stacey Peterson has never been found, a lingering mystery that continues to haunt her family and the community. The case led to changes in the way missing persons cases are handled and focused national attention on the issue of domestic violence and the ability of perpetrators to use the legal system to evade accountability. Number 5. Antoinette Frank, a former New Orleans police officer who committed one of the most heinous crimes in the history of the city's police force, murdering her partner and 2 civilians during a robbery, was born on April 30, 1971, in New Orleans, Louisiana, to a family with roots in the city's 9th Ward, a working-class neighborhood that would become the scene of her brutal crimes. Frank was raised in a turbulent household and showed signs of psychological instability from a young age, but she managed to join the New Orleans Police Department in 1993, after being rejected by several other law enforcement agencies, a decision that would later be scrutinized in the aftermath of her crimes, as questions arose about how she had passed the psychological screening required for police recruits. She served as a patrol officer in the 9th Ward, where she developed a relationship with a local store owner, Quang Vu, who owned the Kim On restaurant and who had employed her as a security guard in the past, a relationship that would turn deadly when Frank, facing financial difficulties and a gambling addiction, decided to rob the restaurant and eliminate any witnesses. The victims of Antoinette Frank's crimes were her own police partner, Officer Ronald A. Williams II, a 25-year-old officer who had been on the force for less than a year and who was engaged to be married, and 2 members of the Vu family, Quang Vu, the restaurant owner, and his 17-year-old sister, Ha Vu, a bright young woman who had a promising future ahead of her, both of whom were working at the restaurant on the night of the murders. Officer Williams was described by his colleagues and family as a dedicated officer and a kind-hearted person who was loved by all who knew him, and his death was a profound loss to the New Orleans Police Department and the community. The Vu siblings were members of a hard-working Vietnamese-American family who had built a life for themselves in New Orleans, and their murders were a devastating blow to their parents and siblings, who had trusted Frank as a protector and a friend. The setting for the crimes was the Kim On restaurant, a small Vietnamese eatery in the 9th Ward of New Orleans, a neighborhood that was struggling with crime and poverty in the mid-1990s, a time when the city had one of the highest murder rates in the nation. The timeline of events leading to the crime began on the evening of March 4, 1995, when Frank, who was off duty but carrying her service weapon, entered the Kim On restaurant under the pretense of checking on the establishment, accompanied by her partner, Officer Williams, who was on duty and unaware of her intentions. Frank had previously discussed robbing the restaurant with an acquaintance, Rogers Lacaze, and had recruited him to assist in the crime, and when she arrived at the restaurant that night, she signaled Lacaze to enter, at which point the 2 of them began robbing the business, ordering the occupants to the floor and demanding money from the safe. The crime itself was a chaotic and bloody massacre, during which Frank shot and killed Officer Williams, her own partner, as he attempted to call for backup on his police radio, and then turned her weapon on the Vu siblings, shooting them at close range as they lay on the floor, while another family member, Quang Vu's wife, survived by hiding in a walk-in cooler and was not discovered by the killers. The discovery and initial investigation began shortly after the murders, when other officers responded to the scene and found the bodies of their colleague and the 2 civilians, a horrific sight that immediately triggered a massive manhunt for the perpetrators. The initial assumption was that the officer had been killed during a robbery by unknown assailants, but investigators quickly noticed inconsistencies in Frank's account of the events, as she claimed to have been in the restroom when the shooting began, a story that did not match the physical evidence or the account of the survivor who had been hiding in the cooler. The forensic investigation involved the analysis of ballistics evidence, which showed that the bullets recovered from the victims matched Frank's service weapon, as well as the testimony of the survivor, who identified Frank and Lacaze as the shooters, providing a first-hand account of the betrayal and the cold-blooded executions. The breakthrough in the investigation came when detectives, acting on the survivors' information and the physical evidence, arrested Frank and Lacaze and charged them with first-degree murder, a stunning development that rocked the New Orleans Police Department, which was already reeling from a series of corruption scandals in the 1990s. The legal proceedings against Frank were lengthy and complex, with her defense attorneys attempting to argue that she was not guilty by reason of insanity, citing her history of mental illness and her attempts to obtain psychiatric help in the years leading up to the crime, a strategy that was rejected by the jury after they heard testimony from psychiatrists for both the defense and the prosecution. The trial began in October 1995, and the prosecution presented a damning case, including the testimony of the survivor, the ballistics evidence, and evidence of Frank's financial motives, while the defense presented witnesses who testified about her mental instability. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning a guilty verdict on 3 counts of first-degree murder on October 20, 1995, and the penalty phase of the trial began immediately, with the jury recommending the death penalty after hearing victim impact statements from the families of the victims. The sentencing hearing took place on November 2, 1995, and Judge Frank Morello formally sentenced Frank to death by lethal injection, making her the first female police officer in the United States to be sentenced to death for a crime committed while on duty. Following her conviction, Frank was transferred to the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, where she remains on death row, appealing her sentence and seeking a new trial, though her convictions and sentence have been upheld by the Louisiana Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court. The lasting impact of the Antoinette Frank case was a crisis of confidence in the New Orleans Police Department, which underwent a major reform effort in the years following her conviction, including changes to the psychological screening process for recruits and the implementation of stricter oversight of officers' off-duty activities. The case also served as a reminder of the profound trust that is placed in law enforcement officers and the devastating consequences when that trust is betrayed, leaving 3 families forever broken and a city grappling with the reality that one of its protectors had become a cold-blooded killer. Thank you for watching to the end of this documentary. If you found this in-depth examination of police misconduct and the justice system informative, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. A like on this video helps tremendously with the algorithm and allows this content to reach more viewers. I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Which of these cases had the greatest impact on you, and what are your thoughts on holding law enforcement accountable? I am also genuinely curious to know where in the world you are watching from right now, as this channel reaches a global audience and it is always fascinating to see the diverse locations of our community. Thank you again for your time and attention, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.